Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to introduce to you one of my favorite writers, Joanna Rakoff. She is the author of this wonderful, funny, and inspirational book, My Year with Salinger, recently translated into Romanian. When it came out in the USA, My Year with Salinger was named the best book of the year by The Guardian and by the School Library Journal. In 2020, it was adapted for the big screen. Joanna Rakoff is a poet, a novelist, and a journalist. Her book have been translated in more than 20 languages. Hello, Joanna. It's a very big pleasure to have you with us just now.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
I enjoyed every pages of My Year with Salinger. It is an exceptional coming-of-age novel about this young girl, Joanna, who is 23 years old. But it is more than that. It's not all. Even if it reads like a novel, My Year with Salinger is a memoir. And this is really wonderful. It is a highlight of our fiction connection collection. This book is the real story of 1 year in your life. How was it so important this year for you?
So my Salinger year chronicles the year in which I worked at New York's oldest and most storied literary agency. It was my first real job. I had gone to college and then grad school and kind of dropped out of grad school. I thought I wanted to be a professor and I realized that I didn't. And that year was hugely important to me, I suppose, which is why I ended up writing about it, in that it made me into a grown-up who could make my own choices, first of all. So it is a coming-of-age tale, but it also made me into a writer. I thought I wanted to be a writer before I took this job. And I had written and published poetry. Actually, I had edited the literary magazine at my university. I had done all sorts of writing type things, but I somehow was afraid to actually commit to being a writer, or even to say that I wanted to be a writer. And working at this agency and seeing other people, including writers I hugely admired, commit to that life of writing, and also meeting and being in touch with J.D. Salinger, who gave me all sorts of advice, really allowed me to make that leap and to say, I am a writer. You know, I am going to commit to this life in which writing is at the center.
Yeah, in fact, I have the impression that this is a book about the turns around books. In fact, readers were always interested in what, in the hidden art of writing a book, in this magical art of creation, in understanding which are the motivation that drives that drives an author. Also, readers know very well what a bookshop is, what a library is, but between the written manuscript until the final book that we can see in the bookstores and that we can buy, there are a lot of steps, very important steps. These steps are still unknown for the general readership. Or your book, it is a book that describes, your memoir describes your life, your activity in a literary agency. And yeah, what happens in a literary agency, it's not so obvious for the readers, only for the professional. On the other hand, one cannot easily forget the first day of the first work day in your life. Can you retell us a little bit what was this first day in this agency that you don't name it? It's the agency with big capitals. Which were your expectations and what really happened during that day?
Yes. So, I mean, I feel like you mentioned that people, I just want to say that the general public readers don't really know how books are made. And I mean, that's in the US, I find that that is very true here as well. And I myself, as a young person, I had been a huge reader for my whole life. And a friend, one of my father's very close friends, was in fact a novelist who had published dozens of books. He was a writing professor at a university, a very good university in New York. He had his own agent, and I would hear sometimes at dinner parties him talk about his agent and his editors. And yet I had absolutely no idea what a literary agency was when I took this job. No idea at all. I was sent to the agency for my job interview by what is called here in the US a headhunter, you know, a person who places kind of a middleman between people seeking jobs and people hiring job seekers. And I had gone to her thinking that I wanted to work at a publishing house. And just presuming that a job in publishing meant working, you know, as an editor's assistant. That was the only thing I knew. I didn't even know that there were publicists and other aspects of publishing. And she said to me, "How would you feel about working at a literary agency?" And I said, "Great," but I had no idea what a literary agency was. And so in my interview, you know, I just kind of faked it. Luckily, the person who would become my boss didn't ask me anything about actually working at a literary agency. I think she just assumed that I would know. And so on my first day, I of course had no idea what to expect. I didn't know any of the agency's clients at all. I knew nothing about the agency. And I feel like it's important to add here that this was in 1996, of course. So the internet existed and email and what have you existed, but there was no Google. There were earlier search engines. There was, you know, like Ask Jeeves or something. There were and Yahoo. But most people didn't, at least in the US, didn't have, you know, the internet in their home. Most people didn't have an email address. It was before you would just search anything that occurred to you. And so if I were to interview for this job today, I would of course start Googling the agency frantically and learn everything about the agency. But in 1996, you know, I got to work on my first day and I knew nothing. And so I arrived and I was quite nervous. I had no idea what was going to happen. And I got there at the time that I was told to arrive, and my boss wasn't there. And I just kind of sat there at my desk, not sure what to do, feeling very uncomfortable, not sure if I could take out my book and read or, you know, get a cup of coffee from the coffee machine. And finally, she arrived, and she was she's still alive, but she's quite elderly now. So I should say she is a very grand, dramatic, kind of glamorous woman. And she arrived, she swooped in past my desk wearing, you know, a mink coat, an enormous mink coat that in the US is called a whiskey mink. It's kind of an orange colored mink. It's a huge coat and huge dark glasses that covered her whole face, with a long brown cigarette. I'd never seen this type of cigarette before, between your fingers, and a cup of coffee in one hand. Just swooped past me, didn't say hello, went into her office and just shut the door. I was like, okay. And eventually she came out and called me into her office. And I was assuming she was going to, you know, say to me, "Oh, you need to read this manuscript, or you need to, you know, file these papers," or I don't even know what I thought she was going to tell me to do. But instead she said, "We need to talk about Jerry." And I, of course, did not know who Jerry was. She clearly presumed that I did. And she proceeded to kind of give me a whole monologue about, you know, how people were going to call and want to talk to him and ask for his address and his phone number. And they were going to be really, really aggressive about wanting to be put in touch with him, but I should under no circumstances put anyone in touch with him. His information would be in my Rolodex, but I was not to give it out to anyone under any circumstances. And movie producers were going to call, and fans were going to call, and everyone in the world was going to call. And I should not give out his information. And people were also going to want to call and talk to her about this Jerry person. And I should not put anyone through to her under any circumstances. I should just say that she's out or in a meeting or too busy. And I just was sort of like, yes, I understand. Of course, I understand. Having no idea who Jerry was. At the time, the most popular television show on, in the US was Seinfeld. So I was like, could this be Jerry Seinfeld? It was the only Jerry I could think of. And then I left her office, and as I was leaving, I happened to notice this floor to ceiling bookshelf right kind of adjacent to her office that my desk actually faced. And I noticed that the entire bookshelf was filled with editions of J.D. Salinger's works, all of his works, every language you can imagine, every edition from the first to the most recent, paperback, trade paperback, hardcover, everything, hundreds and hundreds of Salinger books. And I was like, oh my God, the agency represents J.D. Salinger. And then suddenly I realized, oh my God, his name is Jerome David Salinger. That's Jerry. And suddenly I realized this job might be really different than what I was expecting. I didn't know what to expect, but whatever it was, this is going to be pretty different. It's going to be all about Salinger.
Very fun, yes. In fact, J.D. Salinger was very, very popular at the time, at those times, in fact, and he was like a kind of myth inside this agency, which in fact the real name of the agency is Harold Ober, is one of the oldest literary agency in the world. But in fact, in a literary agency, there are a lot of clients, a lot of authors, and we know very well that Harold Ober represented also Agatha Christie or Fitzgerald or even I don't know, Faulkner, I think. So there
Yes.
were a lot of important authors. Why Salinger was so special, so avoidable? Why did he had a special regime?
Well, I think there were two reasons. I mean, it's true. So Harold Ober Associates, that's the actual name of the agency, yes, did represent so many great authors, particularly of, say, the 20s and 30s, through sort of the early 50s. So, they represented poets from back when, at least here in the US, poetry was more of a money-making prospect than it is now. Now poets don't really have agents, but people like Langston Hughes, Dylan Thomas, they represented a lot of big mystery writers like Raymond Chandler, and all sorts of huge people. It's true, Faulkner was initially a client of Ober. He left eventually, but they represented his first books. A huge children's book author here in the US called Judy Blume, who's like probably the most famous children's book author of all time. Now, like J.K. Rowling, I guess, is more famous, but at the time she was the most famous. And so I think that what made Salinger different than any other client, like for instance, F. Scott Fitzgerald, another huge, huge client for the agency, who was of course long dead, but still his books, made tons of money for the agency, and he was sort of the biggest client, I suppose, other than Salinger. So part of what made Salinger so important is that I think, unlike all those other authors, Salinger was not just, and is not just, a writer. He was an icon and honestly a celebrity. It's hard to imagine now because the world has changed so much, and the way we think about writers and authors and the literary world in general has changed so much. But in the 1950s and the early 1960s, when Salinger first rose to fame, he was a true celebrity. I mean, he was on the cover of Time magazine, for instance, which, you know, not that many writers ever have been. And his stories were so popular that when there was rumor that he was going to have a new story in the New Yorker, people would line up at newsstands at 4 or 5 in the morning to get their hands on a New Yorker before anyone else and before they sold out, because they wanted to read his new story, you know, as soon as humanly possible. He was mobbed by reporters. He was constantly in demand. People wanted to interview him and photograph him all the time. He received so much fan mail that it would come in giant bags at his house. He also, like, you know, a celebrity, you know, in the kind of like, let's just say Kim Kardashian sort of style, he received all sorts of crazy, you know, death threats and people writing to him saying, I'm in love with you and I want to marry you. You know, he was a true celebrity. And I suppose what made him different than a celebrity like Kim Kardashian, or I don't even know who, like, I'm like thinking of all these ridiculous names like Harrison Ford or something. Like, what made him, Julia Roberts, like what made him different is that he was a writer and he didn't want that kind of fame. He did want literary fame. Like, he very consciously sought literary fame. He wanted to be a famous writer, but he didn't want to be, it was almost like he made a deal with the devil. You know, he got what he wanted. He became a super famous author, but he didn't want his privacy to be invaded in the way that it really was, you know, after the massive success of Catcher. And so as time went on, like through the 50s, you know, he became more and more uncomfortable with his fame, but his fame just kept growing and growing and growing. And increasingly, as his fame grew, Harold Ober Associates, the agency, became his gatekeeper, and their job became less to, you know, a normal literary agency, their job is, right, to, you know, to sell a writer's work and to promote that writer. But in a way, Harold Ober Associates' job became the opposite. It became to protect him from fans, reporters, from people who wanted access to him and knowledge of him. So there's a way in which he maintained this very odd place at Harold Ober Associates, because all the other writers, you know, the agents were saying, please interview my client, please, you know, publish a new edition of my client's work, please adapt my client's story or book into a movie or a play or an opera, you know. But with Salinger, they were saying, no, you cannot adapt this. No, you cannot reprint this story. No, you cannot talk to him. No, he will not speak at your party, you know. So it's sort of, and I think the more he said this to the world, the more famous he became, because our, you know, the Western world is so obsessed with fame and everyone wants fame. And he was this person who said, no, I don't want it. Leave me alone. So he really was almost like a kind of deity at Harold Ober Associates.
The very funny part is that despite the interdiction of your boss, you talk to Salinger, and it was just from the first day.
Yes, it's true. In that first talk, my boss said, you know, some people take this job because they want to become friends with Salinger, and they think that taking this job as my assistant is going to give them access to Salinger, and they're going to become his buddy, and they're going to send him their novel that they're writing and what have you. But he's never going to call. He doesn't call. And then an hour later, the phone rang and it was Jerry, and he was calling to tell my boss that he wanted to publish a new book. And so for people that had held my job for decades before me, what she said was true. Jerry did not call, like starting in the 60s, the early 60s, he really was not in touch with the agency at all. But then my year, as her assistant, he called all the time because he was monitoring this new edition of a story of his that he wanted to put out as a standalone book. So we were in touch all the time. So it was very unexpected.
A very interesting part of your book is the fact that one of your tasks in the agency were to respond, to answer to the fans, to the thousand tons of letters that you received, that Salinger received, and at that moment he didn't want to answer to his fan. He ceased to answer. So your task was to answer them, to answer to the readers, and it was this very formal letter when you were you had to say, J.D. Salinger don't want to give you an answer because she never answered to the fans' letters. And the very interesting part of that it's you can tell this story. You couldn't afford not to answer to the readers, and you start to write, to become a writer, in fact, answering to Salinger's fan.
It's true. Yes. That is, my letters to his fans are really the first real writing that I did. And yeah, for those of you out there who haven't read the book, the Salinger in the 60s decided that he no longer wanted to, not just that he didn't want to respond to his fan mail, but that he didn't want to see it at all. And so we didn't pass on any of his fan mail to him. And in fact, his publisher would forward all of the fan mail that came to them to us. And whoever held the job as my boss's assistant, part of that job was responding to all the fans. And we had a form letter that I would type over and over again that basically said, you know, dear whoever, dear Mr. Jones, dear Ms. Smith, thank you for your kind letter to J.D. Salinger. I'm afraid that Mr. Salinger does not want to receive mail from his fans, so I cannot pass it on to him. You know, have a nice life, basically. It was kind of a harsh letter. It was like, it was really trying to dissuade people from writing again, because what they found in the early days was that people would just kind of keep at it. They would write again, they would call, they would say, please pass on my letter needs to get to him. So they developed this very severe letter that, you know, tried to persuade people to just back off. But I was told by my boss and another person at the agency who kind of oversaw the fan mail that I needed to read every letter just to make sure that there was no threat to Salinger in any of the letters. Because as I said, he had received death threats. And if anything threatening came, we had to report it to the FBI, actually. And so I read every letter to make sure no one was super crazy and going to do anything terrible to him or to us, actually. Because people would get very angry about not being given access to Salinger. And there was always the fear that someone was going to go crazy and start screaming at me or my boss or something. So I read all the fan mail, and I was sometimes just so moved by the letters. You know, people, I think, through reading not just Catcher in the Rye, but Salinger's stories, particularly the stories in 9 Stories. People really loved A Perfect Day for Banana Fish. And also Franny, the story, you know, there's the book Franny and Zoe. People love the story Franny, especially. And people would just kind of pour out their hearts to Salinger. So many people felt that Salinger's work was the only fiction they'd ever read that fully captured their quandaries with life, or their personalities, or their familial relationships. And they really just kind of confessed everything to him, or sought advice from him, or asked him for help with things, or just kind of sought friendship with him. They felt that they were kind of friends with him through his characters. And it was very hard to send a lot of these people a form letter, a kind of harsh form letter. So I would, at first, I just started putting aside the letters that I felt really moved by, thinking, oh, maybe I'll figure out a way to kind of soften the form letter. And then I eventually kind of went off the deep end and started writing personal responses to a lot of them. And I would spend days and days thinking about these letters and thinking about how to respond, as in, how would Salinger respond? What would he want me to say to them? And I had actually never read Salinger at that point. So what I was thinking in terms of what would he want me to say was really based on actually what the people were telling me in their letters about him. So it was kind of strange, but I would, I sometimes spent weeks working on these letters and writing draft after draft. And it was the first time that I was able to kind of jump off a cliff and write in the honest way that you need to be a real writer. So when I say that working at the agency made me into a writer, that's really what I mean, I suppose.
The book happens during the 1996, but it was published in 2014. So there are more than 18 years between the real events and the book. Making a calculation, I think that you wrote, it took you more than 15 years to take the decision to write it. I want to ask you, when exactly did the idea of writing this book come to you?
That's such a good
story behind writing this book. What made you create it?
Yeah, that's such a good question, and it's kind of a weird story. I never made the decision to write this book. In fact, I didn't want to. I'm really a novelist and a journalist, and so my first book. It's called A Fortunate Age. It's not come out in Romania, but I had made a living as a journalist while working on this novel. It's kind of a big, epic novel that I thought of as kind of a contemporary version of a big Victorian novel. And I wrote an essay about answering Salinger's fan mail that got a huge amount of attention, more than I really did not anticipate this at all. And this is going back to, I think, 2002, 2003. And at that time, I was already working on this novel, and editors and agents started calling me. My phone just started ringing off the hook. My email inbox was just filled with editors and agents saying, can you turn this essay into a book? And I thought this was crazy because I was quite young. I was 30 years old. I thought, how at 30 would I write a memoir? This is absurd. I don't have enough to say, and I've said everything I want to say in this essay. This is not even about me. It's about the fans. And so time passed. I published my novel and came out, and I became more known as a writer. And about 6 months later, Salinger died, and I found myself devastated. And within a few days, I was contacted by a bunch of magazines and radio shows saying, do you want to write something about this? Because I was also known as that girl that answered Salinger's fan mail. So I wrote another essay and did some radio pieces. These were turned into, by me, a radio documentary for the BBC. That was, again, focused not on me, but on Salinger's fans. That took about 9 months to put together. And the script for that documentary was circulated in the British publishing industry, and an editor at Random House UK read it and contacted me and said, do you want to turn this into a book? And I, again, said, no, this is crazy. It's not a book. I was working on a new novel. And eventually, basically, that editor convinced my own agent, I have an agent, of course, ironically, convinced my agent really that I should do it. And I still didn't want to. And she actually thought she decided it was a good idea and said to me, why don't you just take a week and try to write maybe 20 pages, just see. And I was like, no, I have nothing to say. I'm not writing this book. But because I trust her, I did it. I took a week, and what the result was the first 20 pages of the book that you see verbatim, like probably maybe a word or two have been changed. And I suddenly realized that this book was about something larger than myself, that it was about a moment in time, 1996, when the world was about to change. It was about, what does it mean to be a writer? What does it mean to be a person in the world? What does it mean to be a young woman living in a large, dangerous city? by yourself. You know, what does it mean to be a woman trying to carve a path for yourself, you know, in an industry, but also as a writer. And I decided, okay, because this is about something larger than myself, I can write it. And that was the point. This was 2011 by this point, that I decided, okay, I'll write it after writing those 20 pages.
Yeah, it's a larger book than yourself. On the other hand, you wrote this novel, A Fortunate Age. You have constantly written for different publications, Opera Magazine, the New York Times, Vogue, etc. My Salinger year is a different experience of writing because it is also about yourself. My question is it more easier or more difficult to write about yourself than to write about others?
That's such a good question. I think it's more difficult, honestly. I really do. I think it requires to write well about yourself. So you can write about yourself in a very superficial way, and people might like it, and that's fine. You know, I've read so many memoirs and personal essays that are delightful, but they don't really go deep into either the world of the book or the person's psyche. And I was not interested in that. I really I needed the book to be about things larger than myself, but I also needed to write with profound honesty about my life. And I found it very, very difficult. There were days when I would sit at my desk and just kind of put my head down and cry, because I was forced to re-examine things that I myself had done that I found either embarrassing or deplorable, things that I regretted, and I just hadn't wanted to think about. And if I hadn't written a memoir, I could have gone my whole life without really thinking about them, without just, you know, just sort of saying, okay, that happened, I don't need to think about it. But writing the book really changed my life, and I think made me a better person, a person who's more honest with myself about who I am and what I want. And I think ultimately it made me a better journalist and fiction writer and friend and mother and human.
I have a lot of questions, and I hope with your next memoir that I'm expecting, we will have a new discussion. However, I chose as the last question this one. The movie that was launched in 2020, it was in the opening of film festival from Berlin. You took part to the as an executive, and you wrote the script for this movie. What was like for you to see, to watch for the first time this movie? Because practically is a movie with you. It's not only about you, but it's with you.
It was, I've never experienced anything like it. You know, yes, as I was very involved in the making of the film, you know, I chose the actress who played me. She was my first choice. I collaborated on, wrote the script. I executive produced it. I was on set, you know, watching it be filmed with the incredible, incredible director. But I actually asked Philippe, the director, if I could wait until the premiere at the Berlin Film Festival to see the final cut. And I did. I'd seen dailies, you know, I'd seen scenes, but I didn't see the final cut until the premiere. And I was sitting in this enormous, you know, almost 2,000 person theater with Sigourney Weaver, who plays my boss, and Margaret Qualley, and my husband, who is in the book. He's a character called My College Boyfriend, was right behind me. And I was just sobbing throughout the entire thing, not because it was so sad, but just because it was so overwhelming to see this thing that I had made. I'd kind of made it twice. I had made it as a book, and then I had made it as a film, and to see it in front of me as a finished product was so overwhelming. It was more about the artistic achievement than about seeing my life portrayed, you know?
I loved your book very much. I love the story and the writing, and I find a personal approach to it. I had the same age, in 1996, I had the same age as Joanna. And I hope and I wish that our readers find a personal approach to this book. This is the quality of an exceptional book. Thank you very much for being here with us. And yeah, we wait you with your next book.
Oh God, thank you so much for having me. It was such a pleasure to be here. Thank you.